Is April 9th, 2019. This is Liam Schilter, Mike Kroll, and Jake Stockhausen interviewing Mrs. Mary Jo Mance. Okay, Miss Mance, hi.
Hi.
So I'm going to just start out, where were you born?
I was born in St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay. And how many siblings did you have?
I have 4 brothers and 1 sister.
Okay. And what do your parents do?
My parents are no longer living, but my mother was a homemaker, and my father was a tool and die worker, and then later on a manager.
Were they also from St. Louis?
They were. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what was your family life like?
It was very happy. I mean, we lived in a community of people that got along with each other, and there wasn't a lot of diversity there, but it was a great time to grow up. We had a lot of freedom. I think we had more freedom than I allowed my kids to have, just because of the circumstances of the way things are now. But yeah, we had fun and didn't realize there was a big world out there. While I was growing up, we pretty much didn't go a lot of different places from St. Louis, so that was pretty much all I knew.
What part of St. Louis was this?
It's called Shrewsbury, Webster Groves area. It was actually the seat of the seminary for the Archdiocese of St. Louis was located in that community. So the community was made up of the Catholic Church and a lot of other Catholics.
So you're saying it was very Catholic then?
It was very Catholic, yeah. Okay. I think St. Louis in general is pretty Catholic.
So then you attended a Catholic grade school, does that mean?
Yeah, St. Michael's Catholic grade school, which was around the street from where we lived. And we walked there every day. They had Mass every day. We had nuns, only nuns that taught us, except for, I think, 4th grade. I think I had some master's degree student who was teaching on the side. But yeah, it was good.
So then what did you like to do as a family?
We'd go ice skating in the wintertime. There was a big park in St. Louis called Forest Park, and that was actually the site of the St. Louis World's Fair back in, I want to say 1904, but that could have been the Chicago World's Fair, but they were very close to that time. But it's a beautiful park, and the zoo is located there, and so we would do things like the zoo is free, and we would go to the zoo, we'd ice skate in the wintertime. We were all my brothers and my sister were all on softball teams, or if you were a boy, it was baseball. So we spent a lot of time just being outside.
So then your siblings, how many siblings did you have, and in what order did you fall in?
I'm in the middle, the peacemaker. You know, the middle child is always a peacemaker. I have 2 older brothers, and they were 8 years older and 4 years older than me, and then 2 younger brothers and a younger sister who were my youngest brother was 10 years younger than me, so the span was pretty big for being really close friends with each other compared to my children.
So did you play sports when you were younger?
Yeah, I played softball, played tennis. And that was pretty much it for girls.
Yeah.
Boys played soccer. I don't know why we didn't, but that wasn't available to us.
So then your home life, was it more hectic or laid back, it sounds like, with so many siblings?
Well, I come from a pretty big extended family, so I had my mother was one of 8, and they all married and stayed in St. Louis and had about between 6 and 8 kids apiece. So we had lots of cousins, and so there was always family events happening. My dad worked the evening shift for many years, and so we didn't have a car, so we did everything that you could do without a car. You know, so we didn't go very far. If you wanted to go someplace else, you took the bus. But it was, it like I said, there was a lot of freedom. You know, we had jobs that we had to do at home to keep everything kind of orderly, but we could roam, you know, and as long as you were back at a certain time, it was fine. So we had a lot of adventures.
Can you tell us about an adventure?
Well, I remember, this wasn't a good adventure, I don't think, but the streets all had their own kind of societies, you know, and there were many short streets, and one of my neighbor friends lived in the street behind us, and she played the organ for the church, which was right down the street from us, and one evening I just went over there when my parents were at Perpetual Help Devotions, which was every Tuesday night, and I went over to her house and we were just hanging out, and my parents didn't know where I was, and I guess I forgot the time, and so they're calling the police, who they knew, because everybody knew everybody, so they're calling the police to find out about this missing person who I was almost in their backyard. So that was a short adventure. But.
So then you had a lot of friends all around you, did they all went to your grade school too?
Yeah, pretty much. I laugh about this now, and I'm sure that these people didn't take offense to this just because you use terminology in a kind way, but because it was almost a total Catholic community, on the end of our block there was this family that had two boys, and they weren't Catholic, and they went to the public school, and we called them publics, you know, and they were fine with it, we were fine with it, and you know, but I look back on those and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was maybe derogatory, but it wasn't, you know, taken that way or meant that way at the time.
So growing up, I know later you became a nurse. Did you have a favorite class or anything that might reflect that?
I guess I always liked math and science more than I liked history and English, and I volunteered when I was in high school as, or maybe I was in 8th grade, as like a candy striper. So I would catch the bus and go down to like where St. Louis University is now, and you'd be able to, you know, volunteer in the hospitals, and I just liked that kind of atmosphere and liked being helpful.
So did you have many jobs when you were a kid?
That's a good question. I know that I worked, when I got a job, one of my first jobs was to work in a hospital. So I worked as a nurse's aide at the hospital actually where I was born, St. Anthony's Hospital. So I got to know a lot of other nurses there, and kind of an idea of what that would be like to become a nurse. And I really liked it. So I kind of stayed in that field. I think I did work at a nursing home when my grandmother was in a nursing home. I worked in the nursing home where she was at the time, so it was kind of a nice situation to be able to see her more in that setting.
So did you have a lot of, how about jobs at home? Did you have a lot of those?
Yeah, we had, my sister's name is Carol. Carol and I had to do things like dusting and vacuuming and cleaning, things like that. We used to be really upset that the boys got to go out and cut grass and empty the garbage. We thought that was much easier than what we had to do. But yeah, it was those kind of things. I can remember my brother and I doing the dishes after, we didn't have a television until I was like 12, but we would listen to the radio, and they had things like, you guys probably wouldn't know, but like Roy Rogers and stuff like that, these cowboy radio shows, you know, that we would be doing the dishes and listening to this, you know. It's just kind of hard to imagine now that television is, you know, that you would actually sit and be enthralled by this program. I can remember in our living room we had one of those big old radios, you know, and there was a carpet there, and there was like little worn spots where we would sit and listen to the radio. So that was a good memory, yeah.
Were you big into reading when you were a kid?
I was not. And that really bothered me later on when I had my children. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know any nursery rhymes. What am I going to do? And it was like, it was a great time for me to pick up reading for pleasure after I had my kids, because my oldest daughter loved to listen to me read anything. So I got my chance then, later in life, but it's quite an activity that I love now.
So did you spend a lot of time taking care of your siblings then, since it sounds like you were
my youngest brother, the one who was 10 years younger than me, I remember having to do things for him, like take him on walks in the buggy, because my mom would be fixing dinner or something. So it was a chance for her to have a little break. And then I don't know, as kids, parents were never really involved in our neighborhood activities. It was like the oldest kid on the block ran the show, and there were families that sent their kids to dance lessons, and they had all these recital outfits and stuff, and so they would pass on those outfits to the rest of the neighborhood, and we would put on plays in the summertime, and the parents would come to the plays, and they had to pay, of course, and then they would give them everything. Money was always donated to pay for pagan babies, if you've ever heard that term before. Pagan babies were a big thing, so it was essentially giving money to the church, and then they would give it to a charity, so the moms would get together and play canasta, which is a card game, big in St. Louis, and they would put money in, and that money would go to the church, and the neighborhood plays, the money would go to the church, so it was activity.
So was the parish in your neighborhood, was that like in your neighborhood, like everybody went to church in your neighborhood?
Yeah. We had a great assistant pastor who was a young guy that was in there doing everything with the kids and would plan programs in the summertime, and everybody was on the playground doing different activities, and he was being a great cheerleader for all the young people, so it was great.
Did you get along well with your siblings?
Well, actually, we weren't like that close in age enough to feel like there was any competition. So we get along really well now that we're all grown and have more in common, the fact that we're all adults. But yeah, I can't say that any of them were my best friends because we were, farther apart in age.
Did you have a best friend?
Growing up, yeah, I did. Yeah, I had a couple best friends. One moved away when I was in like 6th grade, but just to a different part of the city. And the girls that I went to high school with, we were all pretty close. There was like 6 of us that went to the same high school.
So in grade school, that was in the middle of the Cold War, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So were you, do you remember Red Scare drills or anything like that?
Well, we did have to get underneath our desk when the air raid siren would go off. Looking back at it now, I think that probably wouldn't have protected us very well, but yeah, I do remember that, but I don't think we were actually aware of what the circumstances really were.
So you weren't aware of it. So then, were your teachers? Do you think that they were affected by it very much?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know how the nuns looked at those kind of things.
Okay. And it was primarily nuns, and you said in 4th grade you had that one teacher.
Yeah.
So what were your siblings' experiences then in grade school?
Well, I don't really, yeah, I mean, I think that they were fine. I can't really recollect that much about, for one year, my dad moved out of town, and my parents moved out of town, and I was able to stay behind, but they had to go to a public school because there wasn't a Catholic school there. And my brother, all of a sudden, he would get in so much trouble with the nuns in grade school. He was 2 years younger than me, and when he got down to this other school, he was like the smartest kid in the school. And I'm like, well, I don't know what happened there, but different experiences, I guess, brought out something in him.
And where did they move to?
They moved to Kennett, Missouri, which is in the boot heel of Missouri.
Would you say that was pretty segregated?
It was very segregated. When they moved down there in '67, it was still black separated from white. Yeah.
Did you ever go on vacation when you were a kid?
Not very often. I did find in some of my memories that we went to, we'd go visit my brother, who was a Holy Cross brother, and he was at Notre Dame for many years, and we'd go up to Notre Dame to visit him, or if he was on a novitiate up in Minnesota, we'd go up there to visit him. But we really, I don't think my parents had the funds to go on vacations, but we went down to Lake of the Ozarks, I remember that, and rented a boat, and I found the paper last night about the cost of the cabin that we rented. It was like $12 a night, and for every extra person that was $1.50, and I thought that was amazing. I mean, you know, when you're thinking your memories, you don't think it was that long ago, but obviously it was a while.
How did you get there?
We got there in, I think it was a Ford. I remember a black Ford that had no seat belts in it. And we weren't all together all the time because, like I said, my oldest brother, when I went into first grade, he was already into the seminary. So he wasn't with us. And then my youngest brother probably wasn't born yet, so there was probably only 4 of us that were going on vacation when we did that. So we sat in the back seat with no seat belts.
Okay, so can you describe some of the activities that you did on vacation?
Well, when we went to Lake of the Ozarks, that's a vacation I kind of remember. We rented a boat and did water skiing for the first time. I'd never done that before. My dad loved to fish. He was a great fisherman. And so he would spend a lot of hours doing that. One vacation we went out to Maryland, and we just, since that was the longest place, the furthest place we had ever gone to as a family, we did a lot of visiting around to other areas that we saw that Frank Lloyd Wright House in Pennsylvania, Falling Waters, and we went, I think we went down to Virginia and went to Williamsburg, and so a lot of historical places like that. Swimming, we did a lot of swimming. I was never a good swimmer, so I was kind of like a watcher instead of a swimmer.
Is this the vacation that you met your husband?
Yeah, actually it was, yeah. We were both like 16, and he was one of the families that, he was from a family whose dad took care of the priest and brothers at this camp. And that's how we got to know the whole family. And that was nice. He comes from a big family. There was like 8 kids, and they're all very fun and interesting. So it was a lot of fun for all of us.
So any of these vacations, they were usually just immediate family?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you have any relationships with like a lot of your cousins?
Yeah, I was pretty close to most of my cousins because we were kind of the same age, or at least we were the same age as far as my siblings went. So they all had somebody that was their favorite cousin, and we would go to like, they had this thing called sock hops back in the day, and at the different parishes, and so we would go to dances every Friday night, just hang out with cousins doing different things. Not anything terribly exciting, but it was just fun to be together, and I can't really remember specifics, but yeah, it was fun to be with them.
Were your grandparents very involved?
My grandparents we'd always, like, every week we went to see my grandparents. That was like a thing you did, because stores were always closed on Sunday. That's the blue law or something like that. And so on Sunday it was just a time to visit family, and my mother's mother and father lived pretty close by, and we would go there every Sunday night, and they had a television. It was about this big. and a lot of the cousins would come that same night, but the parents loved to play pinochle, and so it was a card game that they played while the kids sat around this 11-inch TV and watched cowboy movies or whatever. And yeah. And then my other grandparent, and they were kind of a rowdy, kind of fun-loving family. My dad's father died before my parents were married, so I never met him. But my grandmother was very sweet. They had much more reserved family. It was all women except for my dad, so he had 4 sisters. And so when we went to their house, it was more quiet conversation or playing mahjong or, something like that. But we were rowdier at our other grandparents' house.
Okay, then how about high school? What high school did you go to?
I went to Ursuline Academy, and which is run by the Ursuline sisters, mothers. We used to call them Mother. And that was not too far away from where I lived. It was in Kirkwood, Missouri, and had to take a bus to get there until we were 16, where one of the girls I went to grade school with was able to get a 56 Chevy from her parents to be able to not carpool, but because we didn't pool at all, but she was the driver, and we all piled in there to get to high school.
Did you, in high school, have a favorite class or any particular subject that stood out to you?
I think the sciences, again, were biology, chemistry. I thought math was great until we got to, was it calculus? And I was like, this isn't fun anymore. But yeah, like I said, I was not really interested in history or English. I was a terrible writer, and I love that now. I love all that now.
What about like a foreign language?
Everybody had to take Latin, and everybody had to take another, I don't know if you had to take another language, but I took Spanish. So I took Latin for 2 years and Spanish for 2 years.
Did you have a theology class?
And they didn't call it theology back in the day. It was like religion, religious class, I guess. Yeah, and I can't tell you anything earth-shaking about that class, although I'm sure I wasn't paying attention.
And was this an all-girls school?
It was all girls, yeah.
What was your experience with that?
I liked it. I liked boys, and we, the first year we rode the bus, and the boys from the all-boys school, John Vianney was the all-boys school, and we rode the bus together. And so freshman year, when we were all riding the bus, you would be mixing with them. But I liked the freedom of the all-girls school. It was, you didn't worry so much about how you looked or, what you said, or, it was just a lot easier to navigate teenage years.
Is there anything that you'd wished that you would have gotten from your high school experience?
Oh, I felt like I got everything I could get. I played a sport when I was in high school, and I was in their musicals. We always had big musicals, so you didn't have to be particularly talented to be in it because everybody was in it. In fact, I think we put on Showboat one year, and we had so many people in the cast that the actual Showboat had 2 levels, and the top level caved in, luckily at one of the rehearsals and not during the show, because we had so many people in it. But yeah, it was enjoyable. I did average. I think I was a pretty average student, but got a lot out of relationships with other students. Made a lot of good friends.
Do you keep in contact with any of them?
I was keeping in contact. One of my best friends died recently, so that was very sad.
And you said that you were doing nursing in high school at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was working at one of the close by hospitals, and pretty much was working in maternity, so it was with young mothers and getting a sense of what that was like,
So you think that you gained a lot from that?
Yeah, I do. I look back on, mostly reflective, like looking back on what that was like for mothers that were, that had very stable families, and some mothers that, did not. Some of them had to give up their children for adoption, and, so you kind of got a feel for what that must be like.
And when you graduated, were you sure that you wanted to be a nurse at that point?
Yes, yeah. So I went into nursing right out of high school, and it wasn't. We were connected with St. Louis University, but it wasn't a university program. The popular programs, if you wanted to work primary care, which is what I wanted to do, were 3-year programs, and there were a lot of them in the city. And that's one of them that I was connected to, and it's called DePaul School of Nursing.
Can you tell us about the Army recruiter experience?
Yeah, that was in my senior year, and so that was like 1968, and the recruiter, they were looking for nurses because they were so involved with Vietnam that they were using a lot of nurses in Europe and in Asia, Japan, and that area that they were, and you only had to serve a year abroad, and so they were constantly needing to renew that. And they were able to pay for part of my education. That, I think that was the drawing card, was that I was running out of money. and this was going to be very helpful. And 2 of my other classmates decided to do the same thing, so it was like, we felt like, we weren't alone in that.
So was money tight for your family?
Yeah. I mean, I never really noticed it, looking back on it, because I felt like, I worked my way through high school. I worked in the cafeteria, and, when you think about what your parents pay for high school here, and we paid it was like $750 a year for high school then, and I had a lot of siblings, and my dad didn't make a lot of money, and my mom didn't work. So, so we were given a lot of encouragement to do what we wanted to do, but you had to figure out how to do that. So I'm grateful for my parents maybe not having as much education as they would have liked to have, but they never interfered with what we wanted to do, and they were very encouraging, and I felt like it put more of the onus on us to be able to take credit and blame for what you did. You know, you couldn't say, well, my parents made me do this or wanted me to do this, you know. So that was a good thing that I look back on, saying I'm grateful for their encouragement and letting me make decisions on my own. So.
How did your siblings take that you were going into the Army?
Yeah, I had an older brother. My brother, who was next oldest to me, went into the Air Force, and because he wasn't sure what he wanted to do right out of high school, so he went into the Air Force. And so I think, you know, it was just kind of a lot of people were in the service, and then the draft was still going on. So, you know, even if you didn't really want to go in, you know, that wasn't a choice for a lot of people. So yeah, it was just something. I had uncles that served in World War II in France, and you know, it was just something that was available if that's what you, as a girl or a woman, if that's what you chose to do.
What was your family's outlook on the Vietnam War, or even just yours?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this before, that I was really, I can't say I was sheltered, but I was really not that interested in history and what was going on in that aspect. I'm sorry that I wasn't when I look back on it, and I tell young people that all the time, that, you know, I trusted that our government was making the right decisions. I trusted that this was the way it was supposed to be, and I don't think that that's the way we should be looking at things. And I wish that I had been a lot more. But I was telling you, I was talking to this friend today, right before I came, who we were there together, and she said, "Yeah, we really didn't know what we were getting into, and then when we came back, we had no idea what had been going on in our country while we were gone." So that was kind of a shocking thing to come back to.
And you still believe this, that we should be skeptical?
I believe we should be informed. I believe we should be involved. And if you're not informed, I think you're leaving that to somebody else to make decisions that maybe are not right. And so I do believe that. I believe that we have to be, we can't sit back and think that somebody else is going to take care of things. We have to at least be aware of things, and if there's something that's not right happening, we have to have a voice in that.
Okay. Well, going back to high school, what year did you graduate?
66.
Okay. So, do you remember the JFK assassination or any particular historic event?
I do remember where I was at that time. It seemed like it was around noonish or something, and I was getting ready to go to gym class, and so we were in the hallways moving from classroom to the gym, and they made this announcement, and I think he was probably one of the few people that I paid attention to, just because he was attractive and he was interesting and famous family, and so that was intriguing so I knew a little about, and it was very sad and shocking that this happened. Because I don't think I had ever thought about someone being assassinated, or someone that, that you knew, your own country. So.
How do you think this affected the other students and your teachers? I can't really recall that. I'm sure we are all individuals and we all had a little different take on it, but I think it was shocking to everyone and saddened by everyone that this was somebody who was going to be for us and was important, that could speak out, and for those less fortunate too, which I think was kind of the Catholic background, is that you're always trying to look out for those less fortunate. And
so do you remember anything like segregation protests or any civil rights acts going on around that time?
I don't really remember it from that time, no. And I mean, I know Milwaukee had a major uprising with that, and I don't recall that, but I really felt like growing up I was pretty sheltered from the outside, even from the city, because we were like the distance from the city was not very far, but it wasn't like we weren't like in the city where things would be happening, probably. And we just, I don't remember even getting out there very much. You know, it was kind of we didn't have a car, and you just kind of hung around the neighborhood pretty much.
So how about after high school? So you went to college, and then after that, what did you do?
Then we were in the Army.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was there any places that you went in between that?
While I was in school, while I was in nursing school, you mean? No, we were pretty busy. I mean, we were in school year round, and we were most of us were working on the weekends at the hospital to save up money to pay for education and that. I don't recall any like vacations that we went on as young people.
So then what boot camp did you go to?
It was in San Antonio, Texas. It was called, I'm not going to be able to remember, this is where I run into trouble remembering names of things. But it's in San Antonio, and that's where the Army Medical Corps all went to before they got sent to their different assignments.
Do you remember any particular emotion of leaving home for the first time?
I was excited. I was excited to go, to see something else, to see what the world was like out there. I mean, it was an adventure for me.
What was the boot camp like? What was your daily activities?
It was a lot of finding out what the military was all about, like how to salute and how to march, and it was partly about that, and then because we were doctors and nurses at this thing, it was a lot of procedural things that we were doing, putting tracheotomies in goats and things like that, that I had no idea we were going to be involved in. But we had a couple survival things where they'd take you out into this, 2 or 3 of you together out into this woods area, and then leave you there, and you had to figure out your way back, and but it was fun. We had a good time. It was a lot of guys and a lot of girls, and we were all young, and so it was fun to party together and just have this new adventure. We were also with a couple other people that I had grown up with, one was a registered dietitian, and she went on to San Francisco for her tour of duty, and we took some side trips and went to New Orleans, and I think I visited an uncle that lived in Houston, but that was pretty much the extent of it, because they kept us pretty busy until we were ready to go.
Do you think that prepared you for your experience in Vietnam?
No. I don't think anything prepared me for that.
Do you think that they could have?
No. It was the actual procedural things that we did. Once we got to Vietnam, it was kind of like on-the-job training, because you would probably never do that in a regular civilian setting, and and it was something that we probably wouldn't do once we came back again. It was just procedures that they just needed another hand for, and you were there, and so you did things like put in chest tubes and stuff that nurses just do not do. But it was more the emotional thing that you can't prepare yourself for, you know. The kind of wounds that we took care of were devastating, and we were dealing with young men that were, you know, drafted and didn't necessarily want to be there for the most part. Certainly didn't want to be in that kind of setting where every day you were scared for your life, and then, you know, like the kind of injuries we took care of were multiple amputations and head injuries. And I remember this one guy he was like 18, and he was drafted before he could go to college, but he had a scholarship to play basketball, and he had an amputated leg, you know. And I was just, you know, those kind of situations where you would get so involved with trying to help somebody to improve their health, and they would die, you know. And so those kind of things, in my nurses training in school and in my work before I went into the service, I never saw anything like that to that degree. And so that was, and luckily I was there with a friend, because I know some people weren't there with anybody that they knew, so I think that would be much harder to navigate emotionally if you didn't have somebody that knew you before you were there.
Did you stay in contact with that friend?
Yes, yeah, I talked to her a couple days ago, in fact, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So we share memories and stories and try to remember.
Where is she from?
She's from St. Louis also, and she lives in Florida now.
So did you know her growing up also?
No, I didn't know her. I met her when we were in nursing together.
How did you stay in contact with your family in Vietnam?
Wrote letters, and then there was also this thing I remember being, you know, because it was like the change of time was like, I guess they were like 12 hours difference or something like that. So it would be like, so when I was working the night shift, it would be morning in the U.S. So we would do these, I don't know what you call these things, but you had to like talk and then say over. So it was kind of a radio thing. And, you know, so you would say what you wanted to say and then say over. And then the other person on the other end would talk and say, oh, you know, you had to do this. So it was a very awkward conversation. But that's, yeah, I don't remember ever using a telephone, you know, to call back to the States.
Did you ever meet any of the locals?
Yes, yeah. The mama-san that we talked about, she did our laundry, and she spoke broken English, you know. So I wish I would have taken French when I was in high school, because that actually had a big influence on their language. But she was very sweet, and you know, would, you know, just take care of us the best she could with, you know, helping to clean our area and do our laundry and try to talk about her family, you know. We'd ask them what they ate. They ate rice 3 meals a day, I think, and but just very humble people, very loving, caring people, and we also took care of them in the hospital too. There were like civilians that were injured. We took care of them. So it was, it seemed like it was a lot of children. And I remember how they set up the unit. They'd be in a bed, and then the parents would sleep underneath the bed in the hospital, you know, to be with their child. We also took care of the Viet Cong soldiers that were injured, that were, I guess they were prisoners of war, but we would take care of them yeah, it was hard to not see people as just as people when they were in the hospital, you know, with injuries. And yet there was this this term that some of the soldiers used that was, I'm not going to be able to remember what, but it was a derogatory term that they used, and that just always bothered me to hear them say that word. And yet I can kind of understand that they were dealing with preserving their life and having to fight, you know, and protect themselves or protect whoever they were supposed to be protecting, that you had to almost vilify the enemy in order to be able to exist in that kind of setting.
And I'm sorry, I don't think I ever asked, where did you work as a nurse?
Oh, it was called the 91st Evac, and it was in Chulai, which is it was on the coastline, and it was about an hour south of Da Nang. I was looking at a map the other day, and I don't think Chulai actually shows up on the map, but Da Nang does, so that's the next biggest city to the hospital where I was. And there were two hospitals where I was. One was a surgical hospital. I don't know why they called it that, because they did surgery at both, but and we didn't really go over there at all. I think we were just too busy, you know, we worked 6 days a week, but 12 hours a day. So we worked from 7 in the morning to 7 at night, or 7 at night till 7 in the morning. And then on the day off, we would be at the beach, or we'd go into the villages. That was, sometimes it was really pretty calm. So there was, you know, so it was safe to fly a helicopter out to a mountain inland village, and you know, they would take medical equipment and do whatever they could do in a day. But I enjoyed that, meeting and being with the people of the villages. They were just very welcoming and friendly.
Do you ever feel like your life was at risk while you were there?
I never did. I don't know whether that was false impression, but you know, people went on these trips all the time and came back, and nobody ever got hurt that I knew of. So I think I took it from there that we were okay.
Were there a lot of soldiers stationed there that weren't injured at that hospital? That contributed to your safety?
Well, there were a lot of soldiers that, you know, that weren't out in the field, you mean? Yeah. I'm not sure what they all did, but, you know, communications and different things like that. But I didn't really, the one fellow that I told you taught me how to photograph and develop photography. I can't remember what his other job was, and that's just my memory going. But
what was the hospital like? The hospital itself?
It was. It looked like a enormous hoop house, if you know what those look like in gardens. They're kind of like oval like that. They call them Quonset. I think they call them Quonset huts, and they were. I am trying to think how many patients were on each one of those things. I would think maybe 30, something like that. And there was a nurse's station like in the middle, and then a little corridor that went over to the next one over, and that was like the recovery room. So people would come, they'd land on the helicopter pad. They'd usually take them into like an emergency room triage area, usually operate right away, and then they'd come to us and the recovery room and the intensive care. And then there was several other units after that were like medical surgical problems. I had worked on the medical floor for a while for malaria. Malaria was a big thing over there that you got from a mosquito that was infected, and you had to take malaria medicine for like weeks before you went over there, and then you had to take it all the time while you were there, and some people just didn't take it. So that was something that we dealt with.
So the patients that were being flown in, were those primarily people that were like seriously injured and in need of desperate help?
Yes, yeah. They were all major kind of injuries, amputations, head injuries, gunshot wounds, spinal cord injuries.
Did you ever notice like a surge of patients after a battle or something?
Yeah, there would be, like you would hear the helicopters coming in, one landing after the other. And there was, we got to know the pilots of these. They were a Marine Corps group. I don't know what group they were with, but they were a very dedicated group of men that flew these things night and day. And I just can't imagine how dangerous that was. I read an article about how they painted some of the helicopters white with red crosses on them so that they would not be targeted, but it didn't seem like that necessarily helped from what this news article I read about.
Did you begin to develop particular opinions about the enemy, the communists? Vietnamese?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of a natural thing, not knowing any of the history of how this all started. They were the enemy, and they were killing the people that we knew in the South that wanted peace, and that's about the extent of what I knew about it. I didn't know the complication of the political side and that. I think that Ken Burns' documentary on Vietnam is amazing. He did such a good job with, presenting the history and interviewing the soldiers that really surprised me how they felt afterwards. Like they felt saddened by what they had to do, and it lasted with people. I think the suicide rate and the drug rate was just horrendous after this war. During when I was over there, it was 1970, and I think we evacuated in 1973. And so there were a lot of hospitals closing down, so the war was kind of on standstill a little bit here and there. It wasn't that constant thing that was during like the 68 time. And so a lot of drugs were being used a lot during that time. So that was another huge problem over there.
Do you think that America should have even been involved?
Looking back on it and looking at the history of what was happening back in the 1950s, I don't think so. I don't think it was a wise thing to do. But that's just my opinion.
So as a nurse, did you have a ranking?
I went, when I first went into the service, and I spent a year in El Paso before I went to Vietnam, and I was a second lieutenant then. Everybody that was educated in that area went in as a second lieutenant, I think, and then a year later I was promoted to a first lieutenant, which was kind of like a normal thing. It wasn't like you didn't do anything special to get that besides show up at work, I think.
So towards the end, were you relieved to be finally released from duty?
It was really a mixed feeling, because after you spend a year it was pretty much a year. I mean, some people came earlier than I did and left earlier than I did, but for the most part, most of us were there for the whole year together. So it was kind of a mixed feeling of leaving people that you spent every day with for a year, and under those circumstances, that they understood what you had seen and heard and done, and you understood them. and kind of not knowing what you were going back to, not knowing what were you going to do, how were you going to do it. And so it was kind of mixed feelings. I mean, I missed my family, and they missed me, and so it was, I knew that would be good to see them, but I wasn't sure how much they would understand either, so it was.
Do you remember your trip back, like the trip itself?
I remember, I think I had to fly from Chulai down to it wasn't Saigon, it was Tan Son Nhut, I think, is where we left from. Yeah. I remember being in the plane flying down there, and it was like no seats, no seat belts. You were just kind of sitting on the floor of this plane with these ropes hanging down. And I had flown from, while I was there, I had flown twice before that to go to Hong Kong for a R&R time. But the flight leaving was, I don't know, I think it was kind of quiet, like I think everybody was being just kind of thoughtful.
Were these people that were all leaving, was the hospital being left by itself, or were there still?
Oh no, they were still, yeah, they still were working at that hospital.
But these were people that you had come with?
Oh, well, yeah, and I think we weren't necessarily all on like there were several flights, so you weren't necessarily with your closest people. They just put you on a flight. I don't even remember. I don't think my closest friend even flew back with me because I think she got hepatitis and had to leave a little bit earlier than I did. So we weren't even together coming back. But
where did you land in America?
I think I landed in, it was an Air Force base in Seattle area or Tacoma area, and then caught another flight down to San Francisco, and I had a brother who was in that area, and so I stayed with him for a short time before I caught my flight home.
Were your parents there to pick you up?
Yes, my father was there, and he didn't recognize me because we spent a lot of time in the sun when you could. There was beautiful water and beaches there. So I was really very dark when I came home. And I think he saw these people coming off the plane, and he didn't recognize me. I think my hair had grown, and my skin, my complexion was really dark. And so it was kind of funny, actually.
Did you have some type of a celebration?
No, I don't think we did. No.
So after your duty, did you have to be in any type of contact with the Army?
No, pretty much after I finished that, you came back and they signed you off as honorable discharge unless you wanted to, stay on longer. And at that point, I really didn't really want to have anything to do with the service. One of my good friends ended up staying in the reserves, and she just finished that, or retired from that, I guess is what you'd say.
And did you have like a plan for a job or anything by the time that you got back?
No, I didn't. I don't think I stayed out of work too long just because I felt like I needed to be busy. I couldn't just sit around thinking about. I did take a trip out east to visit my friend who I told you I just spoke with before I came here. And she had one more year to go because they paid for 2 years of her education. So she was at Walter Reed Hospital. And so she called me up and she said, you should come out here because some of the guys that we took care of at the 91st Evac were getting rehab at Walter Reed. So we got to be in touch with them again. And one guy actually got a chance to leave the hospital for a while, and we partied at her apartment. And it was great to see that some people did better.
Do you think after your experience you you experienced any type of PTSD or anything like that?
I don't think I did in those words the way you think of it now, but there was definitely a loneliness because people would say to you, "What was it like?" And you know, and some people I just got the feeling that I know they didn't want to hear what I had to say, so I wouldn't say it. And other people, I thought maybe they'd want to hear it, and then when I'd start to talk about it, you could tell it was really uncomfortable, and so it was just very lonely that you just felt like nobody really understood what you had seen and heard and been through, and if they did know about it, they didn't really want to share in it. You know, it was too painful maybe for them too. So that part of it was hard, you know, and I think that's what kept me connected to my friends who I had been in the service with, that we knew that you could always talk to them.
At this point, what was your husband doing?
Well, I wasn't married yet, so I didn't get married until I was like 30. So he was a microbiologist, and he was working on his master's degree. And we weren't really in touch with each other until about 2 years before we got married, and he decided to go into medical school, and so he took this great trip out west. He's from the east, and he had never been off the East Coast, and so he took this great trip west and ended up in St. Louis for a short layover, and we reconnected at that point, and then kind of dated long distance for a while.
So after that time, did you stay in St. Louis after your time in the Army when you got back?
Actually, I was dating someone who was in the service, and he was in Da Nang when I was in Chulai. And when he came back, he was going to be working on a master's degree at Iowa State. And so I moved up to Ames to see if this relationship was going to go anywhere. And I went back to school. That's the point where I went back to school to take all those classes I didn't take when I was in nursing. So I took some history classes and English class, psychology classes that were great. And I think as an older student, I did much better. You know, I was just ready for that kind of education then. And that relationship didn't work. We ended up being great friends, but I came back from Iowa and then didn't know what I wanted to do. Went up to New York and worked at a camp for handicapped kids up in, it was just north of the cities. And that was a great experience too. Because I'd never been there before, and I had never worked with children before. And these were all kids who had all different kinds of handicaps, and it was great how this camp it was called Wagon Road Camp, and it was part of Children's Aid Society. So they did a great job with getting these kids out of kind of the inner city of New York to the fresh air and to all kinds of experiences.
So did you end up finding something that you wanted to specialize in as a nurse?
I knew that I always wanted to do primary care. I didn't want to be in charge of a whole floor and be in charge of somebody else doing what I like to do. So I pretty much wanted to be in intensive care units, and that's where I spent most of my time. I was really afraid of pediatrics for the longest time because I thought, oh my gosh, those kids are so little and they've got all those tubes running every place, and I don't know if I can do that. And then somehow, I think it was after working at this camp, I ended up working at Children's Hospital, Cardinal Glennon Hospital in St. Louis, and I worked in, well, it was all children, but I worked in intensive care, so it was like heart surgery, head injury surgery, and a lot of tubes all over these kids, but that was my introduction to pediatrics, and I've loved that ever since.
Do you think that affected your experience as a mother?
Yeah, I remember one time when I was working, because I was probably the youngest nurse there, and and I wasn't married. Not that I was the youngest, but I wasn't married, and I didn't have kids. And at one point, the intensive care unit was, we didn't have all of our beds filled, and they had an overflow from another. So most of our patients had tubes in. They didn't talk back to you. They didn't fuss, because they were kind of out of it with all this stuff going on. And so we had this kid who was, he didn't have anything serious going on. He was in there, and he was just a brat. I mean, he just talked back, and he was sassy, and and I'm like, oh my gosh, if I ever have a kid like that. And this nurse stopped me right then, and she said, if you have a kid, you'll have one like that. And I'm like, I never forgot that, because at some point, every child is like that, So that was a great opening to being a mother at some point in my life.
So then, when did you get married to your husband?
It was 1978.
Okay. And where did you live at that point?
He was in medical school in West Virginia, and so when we got married, I moved to West Virginia, and then he had to do a lot of training in different places, and so we moved around a lot in the first 2 years we were married. And
it sounds like you're pretty adventurous. Did you like moving around a lot?
Yeah, I really did. I mean, I just felt like I was able to get a job, even if it was for 4 months. I was able to get a job as a nurse, so I had all different kinds of experiences, which I think was great, and that's what I tell people about nursing, is that there's just so much to do with nursing that you never get bored. You never run out of new things to learn and do.
So, is your husband Catholic too?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
How was religion a part of your life, especially in the Army too?
Well, in the Army, we had my two best friends were also Catholic, so that helped. And we had a chaplain that we were really close to, and they had Mass every week, so we could participate in Mass and the sacraments, and we even stayed in touch with this chaplain after we came back to the States. We met up in New York, I think, for a play or something like that. But yeah, it was a big part of choices and decisions that we made when we were overseas, because there was nobody, keeping track of what you were doing or how you were living your life, and so it was kind of our moral basis that kept us from doing anything too crazy.
Is the majority of the Vietnamese population, is that Catholic?
I think there was definitely a sect of population that was Catholic, but I wouldn't say that the people I necessarily met were Catholic. But that's a good question, as they say.
Yeah. So you moved all over. How did you end up settling in Milwaukee?
Well, we lived, when my husband finished his internship in Columbus, Ohio, he wanted to work with his dad, who was getting older, and he said, I just want to have some time working with my dad. So he didn't do a residency right away. And we went back to Maryland and lived there for 6 years, and then he decided that he really needed more training, so he did a residency in Milwaukee.
And you just stayed here?
Yeah, we had 4 kids when we moved here. We had 2 more a year later, and it was just, the kids were in school, they had made friends. It was hard to think about going someplace else. My husband had a job right out of finishing his residency, so yeah. And it's a lot like St. Louis in a way, and it was close to St. Louis, so I could visit my family pretty easily.
Is there anything about Milwaukee that you like a little bit more, or?
I like the fact that it's smaller than what I came. St. Louis is large. Other cities we were in large. I like the fact that it's small. I like the fact that it's ethnic. I like where we live, that we can get around. We can go downtown in 10 minutes, or we can be out in the country in 20 minutes. And people are very friendly here. Every time we've gone on vacation, the friendliest people we've ever met have been from Wisconsin and Minnesota, no matter where we were. And and made a lot of really good friends. I think through our kids, of course, we made a lot of adult friends through them.
What was your initial impression of Milwaukee?
Oh, I had no clue. I think my husband dropped us off at like the domes with, because he had a meeting to go to or something, and we didn't have a place to live when we first moved here, so he like dropped us off at the domes, and I'm like, I got these 4 kids running around the domes, and I'm like, oh, well, I guess this is going to be fine.
So was the segregation, when you initially came here, did you see that kind of similar to St. Louis?
Like I said, I really didn't know. I mean, I knew that there was, well, I see what you're saying. So we moved into Wauwatosa, and we lived there the whole time, which is pretty white. And the longer I've been here, the more I've gotten to know about, the separation, the starkness of the separation. And I'm very involved now with the 53206 neighborhood and with McCann and Brown Homeless Sanctuary. So I work a lot in the city now, and I really love that. And I really love being able to get to know these people as people. It's just been such a good experience, and having a relationship rather than just, doing things, actually getting to know people.
Have you stayed in contact with people from Maryland?
Well, it's a lot of family. I had one really good friend who I still keep in touch with, phone calls now and then. If we're ever back in that area, we always go visit. But it was mostly family, and we still have my husband's sisters. A couple sisters live out there. My brother actually married my husband's sister, and so they have a whole family out there too.
And do you head out there very often?
At least once or twice a year. Yeah, because we have kids that live in California now, so we have to do both sides of the map there.
Yeah. How many kids did you have?
We have 6. Yeah.
And what was the spread of them?
I think what I figured out is I had 6 kids in 8 years. So the oldest one was 8 by the time, but I had twins at the end, so which was a total surprise. Back in the day, you did not know that until.
And did they all go to Catholic school too?
They all went to St. Jude School, yeah, and then they all went to Marquette and Divine Savior.
What was your experience as a parent?
I was really happy because where we lived in Maryland, there weren't any Catholic schools. The one Catholic school had closed many years ago, so I was happy to be in a place where the kids could go to Catholic school. And I felt like, the Catholic schools have a great education foundation here, and I mean even the public schools do too. But I felt like they got that spiritual part of the education that I really wanted them to have, and I just pray every day that continues.
Do you think that they stuck with it?
Well, in different ways, yeah, in different ways. I think they're all really good people, and they all really, know that there's a God out there, and not all of them follow religion the same way traditionally that I would feel comfortable with, but I'm thinking that I'm not the one in charge, so I think they'll be good.
So moving to Wauwatosa, you mentioned during the pre-interview, a Summerfest situation just when you moved?
Oh yeah, when we moved here, I didn't. I'd never been to Milwaukee before, and we didn't know what some of the activities were. But when we moved here, it was like June the 23rd, and it was the beginning of Summerfest, and we were looking for a hotel, and they were saying, you can go to Green Bay or you can go to Rockford, or because there's no hotels available, and so we ended up in Port Washington and found this Airbnb that this lady had just gotten a license for, and it wasn't Airbnb; it was just a bed and breakfast, and we said, "Do you have room for?" There were 6 of us at that point, and she said, "Well, I do," and she said, "But I don't have enough room to, if you have to stay all in one room," and we're like, "That's fine, But our son also had developed the chicken pox on the ride out, so that was terrible because she was really nervous about that with the health department and everything, that having somebody with chicken pox. So we had to wake everybody up and ask them if it was okay if we stayed there for the night. And then we didn't have breakfast because we couldn't be hanging around with everybody else. So that was kind of an introduction to welcome to Milwaukee.
Did you meet a lot of people through the parish right away?
Yeah, we did. That was initially where we met everybody. I can remember people would introduce me to other people, like I'd meet them in church in the morning, and they'd say, "Oh, you have to meet so-and-so. They have kids the same age as your kids," and then once the kids were in school, then we made a lot of connections that way.
Have you stayed in contact with a lot of those people?
Yeah, we're still see a lot of them, in different organizations or social events. Yeah, it's a great community of people.
Do you live in the same house that you originally moved into?
Same house.
Oh. And was it a large house?
No. No. It actually had 5 rooms that you could call bedrooms because the people before us added on to the house, and they had like a carport, but they built 2 rooms above the carport, and but we only have 1 bathroom upstairs. But there's 2 doors that go into it, one from the kids' room side and one from our side. And we would have all these foreign exchange students staying with us who were all only children. It seemed like everybody was from an only child, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I hope they do okay here with this, craziness of all these kids and, doubling up in rooms and stuff like that. But they were all great, and it didn't seem like, now I wish we had more space just because everybody's got a husband, a wife, boyfriend or girlfriend, grandkids, so that when we get together, we try to make it an outdoor activity rather than an indoor one. But yeah, it worked for us. So.
Did you guys do a lot of vacations?
Yeah, we did. We'd take the kids out to national parks. We went out to the Tetons and Yellowstone, and I was, once my kids got to be teenagers, I was in fear of New Year's Eve parties. And so we would go, and the kids knew how to ski, and so we would leave after Christmas and we would go out to Colorado, and we went to a different place every year, and came back after. My one son was born on January 5th, and he would say every birthday we were on the road coming back from Colorado, so he didn't get to celebrate the way he wanted to, but it was, I never had to worry about the kids being at some boozy New Year's Eve party.
So were they all pretty good kids, or?
They were wonderful kids, yeah.
Yeah.
They now that they're like 30 and over, they tell me all these things that I didn't know was happening at the time. So they were great. They were great, and they had great friends. I never had anybody in my house that I just didn't feel like I could have adopted any of the kids that they brought home. They were just really, they knew how to pick good friends.
how did they all come to leave Milwaukee?
Well, the oldest one is out in California now. She's my adventuresome one. She's been all around the world, and the kids, when they were in high school, studied abroad, like the girls did anyway. They went to France for a year, and then they went back another year after college and taught English in a different city in France. And so the oldest one loved to travel, and she just went everywhere. And she decided to go into law, so she went down to Miami School, the University of Miami, and then ended up going out to California, didn't pass the bar right away, and decided that, well, if you can't pass the bar, you might as well go back to school. So she went back to Berkeley and got a master's in policy or development or something like that. And then she did pass the bar, and is now, she teaches law at Stanford, and she's like in a fellowship, I guess, so she does writing and research and teaching out there. And then my second son went to St. Louis University and then came back here and was working in finance and has 4 kids and lives in Wauwatosa. So that's my gift. And then my next son is out in California with, he's an architect, and he's has twin 3-year-olds. So we keep trying to tell them about those earthquakes and those landslides, and they kind of like the life out there. So, and then I have a daughter in Madison who's a nutritionist, and a daughter here who's she's a school counselor at Arrowhead, and then a son that's in Chicago brewing beer. So he's always welcome at every party we have.
Yeah, so do you get together with your family a lot?
Yeah. Last year was our 40th wedding anniversary, and the kids organized this vacation on the Isle of Palms near Charleston, South Carolina, and they fixed everything. We used to go there like every other year for vacation, and they got the house, and they did all the cooking, and just planned all the activities, and it was great.
So did any of your kids enroll in the Army?
No, and I probably discouraged it because I have talked to them about, my feelings about the war and about politics in general. So I think that and football, I never wanted to do football either. Too dangerous.
So then, do you think that your kids are about on the same page as you with?
I think pretty much, yeah. I think, and I think they're much more aware at a younger age than I was about what's going on. I think, just the advance of communication and, and maybe because we talked about it more and my parents didn't talk about it as much, so it kind of pushed them to have opinions and make decisions.
And how old is your oldest?
She is 38.
Okay. And they all went to college too?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so after coming back from Vietnam, what was your experience of like the United States as a whole?
Yeah. That's a broad question. I think there was when I first came back, I realized what was happening when I was gone as far as the opposition to the Vietnam War. I ran into a doctor when I was working at the VA hospital who made me feel really badly that I had even gone over there, because he was obviously an activist against the war, and I, like he pretty much told me that was, that was part of the problem, is the participation in it, and I just felt like I didn't realize that I was doing anything wrong. I was helping people that were injured and sick, and didn't look at it that way. But it was definitely an eye opener to have somebody confront me with that.
Is that the only situation?
That was the only one that I can remember that, I think other people would converse, and have their opinions, and then I'd be able to say how I felt, and, but that was the only person who I didn't feel like really gave me a chance to, to express myself, that they were just, knowing that I had been there, that I had contributed to the war was offensive to him, and it was hard to, and then looking back on that, I was thinking how these soldiers who were young men who had to do horrendous things and had to suffer, who were so brave that that's what they had to come back to, and I don't know how they, dealt with that.
Would you say that working in Vietnam was the most difficult thing that you've done, or have you had any experiences after that you think are more difficult?
Nursing-wise and emotional-wise, probably it's the most difficult thing I've ever done. Yeah. And
how would you say being a parent, or like,
Oh,
has that helped you being a parent at all?
I never really related the two. I think being a parent is a difficult job too, because you're having to be a guide without taking over someone else's life, and that's not an easy thing. Trying to let that person grow into the person they should be, rather than you trying to mold them into what you want them to be. I'm not sure how Vietnam affected that. I'd have to think about that a long time.
It sounds like your method of parenting is pretty similar to your own parents.
And you know what? I had thought that when I got married and I had kids, I thought, I'm not doing things the way my parents do. And I think you end up doing that, like trying to, and I would always have to remember to ask kids questions rather than tell them things, trying to get them to express themselves and trying to find out where they are without judging that, and just letting them express themselves. So I think that's and I don't know that I learned that from Vietnam, or whether you just kind of learn that with each child. By the time you get to number 3 or something, you might have figured it out.
Have you ever talked about your war experiences apart from talking to your children? Have you ever talked about it before in like a public setting?
Yeah, I did talk to Nathan Hale High School. Had an event that these guys that I don't know where they got my name from, but one of them was a chaplain, and one of them was a Marine, and one of them he was a soldier. I'm not sure what area he was in, but these 3 guys I've kept in touch with, and they invite me to just hang out with them sometimes, so we'll go, have pizza and, just talk about things. And sometimes I feel it a little bit uncomfortable, because they're really very vested in the service and in veterans, and in, helping veterans, and, and in acknowledging the good things that they did, and and I want to be supportive of that, because these
these three men are just very, very good people. But sometimes I don't feel as gung-ho as they do. But so we get together, like I talked at this high school, and we'll get together off and on. And then when they had the memorial, the women's memorial in D.C., I went and met up with a lot of the people that I was in the service with, and we stayed together in hotels and stuff to be able to just have that camaraderie.
Is this the only other experience that you have with like veterans?
Well, the guy's name is Joe Campbell, and he's the one that kind of keeps inviting me to these events. And so the War Memorial is kind of an educational space for introducing young people to patriotism and to the services, and so they try to, they try to get people to, and maybe that's where you got my name, I don't know. They try to get people to provide that kind of education background about the service to different groups, grade school kids, that'll come there through their tour, or they'll go into their, maybe they'll show them like different pieces of equipment or uniforms or things like that, just to show them what it looked like to be in the service.
Would you say that you're very patriotic or proud of what you accomplished?
I'm happy that I was able to use my nursing in a good way. The word patriotism I always have trouble with, because I have a hard time when people say this is the greatest country in the world. Those kind of statements don't sit well with me, because I think there are many great countries in this world, and I think there are many wonderful, beautiful people in every country, and I just don't think we should have so much bravado about, our own country. I mean, I think we're blessed, we're gifted, and we should be grateful for that, but I don't think it's something to separate us from other people.
And would you say that you learned most of this from, or would you say that you learned most of your idea of diversity from your experience in Vietnam, or at least your initial impression?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think because it was kind of my eye-opener to the world and to people, and because, like I said, I was pretty confined when I was growing up until I got out of the city, and that's when I started meeting people from other backgrounds and other experiences, and that was all. I know I'm doing a lot of talking now, but I'm actually a pretty good listener, so I tend to try to use that ability in meeting people, and I think I've gained a lot from that.
So moving back to your family right now, do you have any grandchildren?
Yes, I have 6. I have 4 here in Wauwatosa, the oldest one's 7, and I have 2 in California. So, yeah.
And do you still work as a nurse?
I volunteer.
Okay.
Yeah, so I volunteer. There's 2 free clinics that I volunteer at. One is the Filipino Free Clinic, and the other one is the McCann & Brown Homeless Sanctuary. And and they're both totally different experiences, but some place where I feel like I can still use my nursing skills, and that's something I never want to have to give up. I guess it's just fun for me and interesting.
When did you retire from professional?
I retired in the November of 2016.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that just about wraps it up.
Well, thank you for inviting me
Thank you.
to bring back some memories that I've tend to put in a closet and in a box someplace and
Well,
bring
thank you
those
so
out.
much for agreeing to come here, because
Yeah.
I know it's a commitment.
Well, you guys did a great job. Thank you.
Thanks.